Today we are going to be adding integers for the second day. And so we're going to go with that rule that we talked about yesterday. So what we learned yesterday is that when we had the same sign, we always ended up adding. And so we're going to use that concept today. And so if we had opposite signs, we ended up subtracting. So we're going to end up using that concept today as well. And when we had to subtract, we had to figure out the sign. Well, the sign was determined by the number that was further from 0. And so we're going to see that concept today as well. So let's use that rule when we're looking at these numbers. Negative 51, and we are adding negative 9. Notice that we're going further in the negative direction. So we end up having to add these two numbers because they are the same sign. So when we add that, we end up at 60. And so is it a positive or negative? Well, we're going further in the negative direction. So since they're the same sign, we continue keeping that sign, so we have negative 60. Again, here we have opposite signs. So notice opposite signs here, positive 27, negative 6, means you subtract those two numbers. So when I subtract those two numbers, I end up at 21. Now, is it positive or negative? Well, it's positive 21 because I have more positives than I have negatives. Over on this next one here, we end up having to subtract once more. Notice that we have opposite signs, so we're subtracting. And so when I subtract those two numbers, I get 29. And notice that we have more negatives this time than positives. So that's why I end up at a negative 29. Same thing over here. We're subtracting these two numbers because they are opposite in sign. One's positive, one's negative. So we subtract, we end up at 10. Now, is it a positive or negative? Well, look to see which one's the one further from 0, and that determines the sign. So here we have the same sign, so we're going to end up having to add these two numbers together. So when I do that, I end up at 34. And is it positive or negative? Well, it's a negative because the sign stays the same. We're going further in the negative direction. And you see the same concept with this next one. So again, they're the same sign. Both are negative, so we're adding those two numbers together, going further in the negative direction. And so I maintain that sign, and the answer is negative 40. Well, the next few problems ask us to evaluate an expression, and we're going to end up having to substitute. So evaluate means we're going to put a number, like for A, we're going to put negative 15. For B, we're going to put negative 8. And for C, we're going to put 6. We're going to put those into the expression and then simplify. So we rewrite the 14 plus whatever B is. B is negative 8. That's what it says. B is negative 8. So we're going to put negative 8 there. And then notice that they're opposite signs. So we end up having to subtract those two numbers. So when we do that, we end up with 6. Now, is it positive or negative? Well, more positives than negatives, so our answer is 6. Looking at this next one, we start with the number that we have, which is C this time, which is 6. So we put 6 in place of C. Plus negative 8, and they're opposite signs, so we end up subtracting these two numbers. So 8 minus 6, and that gives me 2. Now, is it positive or negative? Well, there's more negatives this time than positives, so that's why the answer is negative 2. This time we have to substitute two numbers in place. So notice that we have A, negative 15, and B, which is negative 8 this time. So negative 15 plus negative 8. Well, they're the same sign this time, so we end up having to add those two numbers together. And that gives us 23, and it's negative because the sign stays the same. We're going further in that negative direction. Well, this one we have C is 6, so we'll put 6 in place of C. We've got a 5 and A. Let's go back over here. It says it's negative 15. So when I have a series of numbers, I always start with adding up all the positives and then all the negatives and then doing one subtraction problem at the end. So I'm using that associative property. It allows me to group two numbers together. So I group those two numbers, combine them, and then I'll end up combining the two with the opposite sign. So these are opposite signs, so I'm subtracting. So 15 minus 11 gives me 4. Now, is it positive or negative? Well, it's negative 4 because there's more negatives than positives. Let's take a look at our word problems here. Our first one looks as though we're dealing with some temperature. It says the temperature rose. Now, what does rose mean? Does that mean it's getting bigger or smaller? Rose means bigger, so that means we're going to end up adding. So it rose 9 degrees in 3 hours. If the starting temperature was -5. Okay, now typically, you remember how in past problems I've always said you start with the first number, okay? So on the number line, we started with like the -51, and then we added -9. See, here it says this is the starting temperature. This is the first number, so -5. That's what we start with. Now it rose 9 degrees, so rose means I'm going to add 9. In 3 hours. Well, 3 hours did nothing to do with the problem. It could have rose 9 degrees in 2 hours, and the answer would still be the same because they're asking what was the final temperature. Well, notice these are opposite in sign, so I end up having to subtract those two numbers. And the one further from 0 determines the sign, so it's 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Let's take a look at our next one here. Matt is playing a game. He gains 7 points. Gains, is that positive or negative? Well, it's positive. It's a positive 7. And then he loses 10 points. So that's a plus -10. So negative because it's loses. Gains 2 points, so plus 2. And then loses 8 points, plus -8. And so what we're going to end up doing is using that commutative property. I'm commuting the 7 and the 2 next to each other. And then I'm going to commute the -10 and the -8 next to each other. And I'm adding those two numbers together first. So now I'm going to use that associative property. And make sure I combine these two terms first. I get 9 here. Over here I add those two because they're the same sign, makes -18. Now notice they're opposite signs. So now I need to subtract. And that gives me -9. And that is the answer. So we lost 9 points, or -9. Take a look at our next one. New Orleans, Louisiana is 6 feet below sea level. What kind of number is below sea level mean? Well, below sea level tells me that it's going to be a negative number. So -6 represents below sea level. The highest point in Louisiana is Driscoll Mountain, which is 541 feet higher than New Orleans. So how high is Driscoll Peak? Well, if it's 541 feet higher, let's add that 541 to the -6. And then we go ahead and do the work. Now, since they're opposite sides, we subtract those two numbers. So when I subtract those, I end up at 535. Is it positive or negative? Well, it has to be positive because there's more positives than there are negatives. So 535 feet is the top of Driscoll Mountain. Well, the submarine submerged to a depth of -40. Okay, so we're starting there. -40. It's down 40 feet. It dives. Does that mean it went up or down? Well, dives means you went down. So you're subtracting. You're taking away. So, or we're adding negatives. We're adding -57 to that -40. Now notice that they're wanting to know what the new depth is. Well, we're just going to combine those two numbers, add them together because they're the same sign. So -97 feet is how far down that submarine is now. The closing price of the stock market, well, it gained 2 points on Monday. Gained, we talked about before, that meant +2. And then lost 5 points on Tuesday, so plus -5. And then on Wednesday, it lost another point, so plus -1. And then it gained 4 points, so plus positive this time, plus +4 because it gained. And then it lost 6 points, so plus -6. So what we're going to end up doing here is using that commutative property again. Combine all the numbers that are positive together, and then combine all the numbers that are negative and bring those next to each other. And then we can add them together. See, if you have the same sign, you end up adding the numbers, and it's easier to add than subtract. So let's only do one subtraction problem. And so that's what we're going to end up having to do here if we do this using this method. So 2 plus 4 makes 6. And then we add up all these negatives. We have -5, -1 makes -6, plus another -6 makes -12. Well, now I just have one subtraction problem because they're opposite in sign. So I subtract, and I end up at 6. Now, is it positive or negative? Well, it's negative because there are more negatives than positives. So negative 6 points. So basically it went down, or it lost 6 points. So this means the same thing as lost 6 points. Now notice I didn't say lost negative 6 points because the word lost represents that minus sign, or the opposite of. So those are problems that you're going to see on tonight's homework. Good luck.